In his book, What Have We Done?, veteran war reporter David Wood examines the pervasiveness of moral injury among soldiers who have returned from the battlefronts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Long confused with PTSD, moral injury is a more subtle wound, characterized not by flashbacks or a startle complex, but by sorrow, remorse, grief, shame, bitterness, and moral confusion that manifests not in physical reactions, but in emotional responses as subtle as dreams and doubts. In its most simple and profound sense, writes Wood, moral injury is a jagged disconnect from our understanding of who we are and what we and others ought to do and ought not to do. As a soldier tells him, moral injury is a learned behavior, learning to accept the things you know are wrong. Wood describes how most of us have a firm and deeply personal understanding of life's moral rules, of justice and injustice, right and wrong. That sense, our inner compass, is built on beliefs we begin to acquire as infants. But war, by its very nature, tends to suddenly and violently append those remaining moral beliefs. Things don't go well in war, whose very purpose demands death and destruction. This appending is often a gradual process, one that is difficult to perceive. Likewise, moral injury is a wound that sets in slowly, something that occurs, as one Iraq veteran wrote, when a person has time to reflect on a traumatic experience. When Wood writes of moral injury, he refers most often to traumas suffered in combat, by soldiers deployed in foreign war zones on the other side of Earth. But he also notes that one does not have to be in combat to suffer from moral injury. He reminds us that war is something that reaches far beyond the battlefield, something that leaches out into proximate geographies and relationships, seeping deep into the individual and societal unconsciousness. To be in war, Wood states, even in this broader sense, is to be exposed to moral injury. Our team was deployed to work a mission in the deserts of my old station. Before we left El Paso, Hayward came to me to say he needed me at my best. You know the lay of the land. I want you out there helping Manuel to triangulate scout locations, matching up the intercepted communications with what you know from the ground, what you see on the maps. I want to know where they're staging their loads and what they can see from their lookout points. There's a shit ton of dope moving through here. Let's figure out where it's headed. I rode through long days with Manuel and Beto, gazing out the window at the blossoming landscape, bright with green creosote and yellow plumes of palo verde, with red-tipped acotillos and endless orange wildflowers. As we listened to crackling voices on the scanners, I imagined that I might know where they were, and I tried to hold in my mind their high-up views across the ephemeral lushness of the desert. In the late afternoons, we returned to the forward operating base, where we had set up a trailer to serve as our mobile command center. One evening, a few hours before sundown, Hayward suggested that some of us take ATVs down the back roads to survey the approach to a nearby scout hill. You guys go, I told him. I'll stay back and work on the shift report. Half an hour after leaving with Manuel and Beto, Hayward called me on my cell phone. We ran across a quitter, he said. Can you transport her back to the base for us? Sure, I said. I asked if she was all right, if she had water. She's fine, he assured me. When I arrived, I saw Hayward, Manuel, and Beto standing over a small woman sitting in the middle of the dirt road. Hayward walked over to me as Beto and Manuel continued speaking with the woman in Spanish. We checked her pockets, he said. This is all she had. He handed me a cell phone. Her group left her behind. Looks like she's got a pretty bad limp. Probably has some nasty blisters. Manuel and Beto walked the woman to the back of my patrol vehicle and helped her into the back seat. Vete con cuidado, señora, Manuel told her before shutting the door. I looked up at the sky and then at Hayward. You should get going, I told him. There's not much daylight left. Whatever you say, boss, he said. Just don't forget that report. As I drove down the dirt road back toward the base, I looked at the woman in the rearview mirror through the mesh of the metal cage that separated us. I tried to think of something to say, but found myself unable to speak. Is it all right if I roll down the windows? I finally asked. Lo que usted quiere, oficial. I rolled the windows down and turned to look at the woman. ¿Me puedes tutear? I told her. Cool air blew in from outside, and I gazed... Cool air blew in from outside, and I gazed beyond the road at the dust devils creeping across the warmly lit valley. A myriad of clay-colored cones whirling in the distance. For a short time driving down the open road, I felt a strange and familiar sense of freedom, an old closeness with the desert. Perhaps there was something comforting, I thought, about being able to look out across the landscape and see for myself the horrors laid upon it. I looked again through the mesh to the woman seated behind me. She stared out the open window, her hair whipping at her sun-wrinkled face. I wondered what she might have seen, what she might feel looking out at the desert, and I was certain it was no sense of freedom. At the forward operating base, I parked and helped the woman out of the vehicle. I offered her my arm as she limped up the walkway to a small holding area. Inside, she sat on a cold steel bench as I asked her a series of questions to fill out her voluntary return papers. The only semblance of conversation I was able to have with her. I'm 46 years old, she told me. I was trying to get to Phoenix to see my husband. My group crossed 4 days ago. They left me after the second day. I come from Guerrero. After filling out the paperwork, I asked the woman if I could see her feet. I'm an EMT, I told her. I can tell you how bad they are. She took her shoes off slowly, embarrassed at the smell. It's all right, I said. I've smelled it before. As she removed her socks, the fabric stiff with days of dried sweat pulled at the skin of her soles. The balls and heels of her feet were covered with silver dollar-sized blisters. I opened a medical kit and put on a pair of gloves. I touched her feet, turning them slowly in my hands. They're okay, I assured her. I've seen worse. Most of your blisters are unbroken. I cleaned her feet one at a time with disinfectant wipe, swabbing the fluid from the edges of her broken blisters and smearing them with ointment. Slowly I unraveled a roll of white gauze around each pallid foot, then covered them gently with an elastic wrap. As I looked up, I saw that the woman had been watching me with her head resting on her shoulder. Eres muy humanitario, oficial, she told me. I looked down at her feet and shook my head. No, I said, I'm not. The horrible thing is when you are dreaming, the Sicario tells his interviewers. You have very realistic dreams. I would dream that I was running through the streets jumping over cars. Oh, I would dream that I was out there and did not have my weapon and they were chasing me. And the dreams were so real that I would wake up and the gun was on the pillow and I would have my weapon in my hand and I would be aiming it. I was very violent, the Sicario explains. The dreams are not things that could never happen. They are not fantastic dreams, but very realistic. The fear that I had that kept me from sleeping in my house with my family. The reason I would go someplace to sleep by myself. It was because the least little noise would cause you to react violently. One time my wife tried to help me when I was dreaming. She saw I was having a nightmare and tried to wake me up, but when she touched me, my reaction was to grab her by the throat. I was strangling her. I was strangling my own wife. The Sicario's huge hands tremble as he makes a gesture of strangulation. His fingers stretch out and quivering. From that moment, he says, that very moment, I realized that something very bad was happening to me. I was no longer any good. There was a line that I had respected between the work I did as a guard, as an instructor, as an executioner. But this work no longer stayed on one side of the line. Events like this finally led him to leave the business of killing. During your trajectory through life, he explains, there comes a moment when you hit a roadblock, you reach your limit. To sever ties with the cartel, the Sicario fled with his family and began a life in hiding. A life that would be plagued with a new and unwavering fear. He accepted a friend's invitation to accompany him to a prayer service at a Christian church. My surprise was, as soon as I got there, I don't know what I felt. I really can't explain this feeling. I just started to cry. In the film, the sicario begins to weep as he tells the story. His head enveloped by the black hood rocks gently. His voice quavers. I did not hear the preaching, he says. I did not hear anything. I fell to crying. I cried as I had never cried, more than I ever remember crying in my childhood. I cried for 5 or 6 hours without stopping, kneeling down, falling down on the floor, and I heard the people crying for me, and I felt their hands touching me. I could feel the warmth of them touching me. Between deployments, Hayward scheduled our team to spend a morning at the firing range to satisfy our quarterly firearms qualification. After completing the course of fire alongside Manuel and Beto, I asked Hayward if I could speak to him alone. We walked out to the parking lot and stood beside his patrol vehicle. I looked at the ground and he crossed his arms. "What's up?" he asked. I was accepted for a research scholarship to study abroad, I finally told him. I'm going to take it. It's a good opportunity for me. Damn, Hayward said. Congratulations. That's great for you. I kicked at the gravel beneath my feet. I need out for a while, I confessed. I looked up and held my hand out to block the sun from my eyes. I've been wanting to study again, I told him. I'm thinking about a master's degree. Hayward stared off into the distance, squinting at the mountains. I hate to lose you, he said. As we walked back toward the firing range, I told him how much I liked working for him, how much I liked being on the team, how much I'd learned from everyone. We stopped at the edge of the parking lot and Hayward stood and thought. You know, he said, we could offer you a leave of absence. You could do your time abroad and come back and take classes on the side. There's even a program to support agents getting their degree. We can find a way for you to stay on if you want. I remained silent for a moment, clenching my teeth. I can't, I wanted to tell him. It's not the work for me. What Mexicans in the early 21st century have been forced to see, writes poet and essayist Christian Rivera Garza, is without a doubt one of the most chilling spectacles of contemporary horrorism. In her book, Dolerse, the title is the Spanish verb meaning to be in pain, she attempts to construct and deconstruct the pervasiveness of pain in modern Mexican society. Pain is a complex phenomenon which, in the first place, calls into question our most basic notion of what constitutes reality, she writes. Pain not only destroys, but produces reality. The social languages of pain are, in fact, political languages as well. Languages in which bodies decipher their power relationships with other bodies. Thus, at a political and social level, she argues, the language of pain becomes a producer of meanings and legitimacy. Pain, of course, is intimately linked with fear. Fear isolates, writes Rivera Garza. Fear teaches us to distrust. Fear makes us crazy. If we follow the arc of her argument, we see that pain has the power to destroy and to produce its own reality, a reality in turn legitimized and given further meaning through the politics and policies that shape our society. This reality is quite often the reality of fear, a reality that makes us, individually and as a society, crazy, isolated, filled with distrust for our fellow human beings, the people who share our neighborhoods, our cities, our country, our borders, our intractably and intimately interwoven global community, the people with whom we share our very lives. In her essay, War and Imagination, Rivera Garza considers the work of Italian writer and cultural critic Alessandro Barico. He claimed that war has always existed, she writes, in the very bones of a vast range of different civilizations, the adrenaline of war, the excitation of war, the hypnotic song of war. It is only when we, as societies, are able to invent something more exciting, more risky, more adventurous, more revolutionary, that we can say we are truly against war. She calls this a form of radical pacifism. Taking her cue from Brico, Rivera Garza declares, if we want to move beyond war based in fear, the purpose of which is to produce more fear, we'd do better to imagine something more exciting, more extreme, something even more wholly filled with adrenaline. After all, the person who imagines always might imagine that this, whatever this might be, can be different. The person who imagines knows, and knows from within, that nothing is natural, nothing inevitable. I dream that I am out working in the desert, that I have stopped a vehicle on the shoulder of an empty highway. As I walk toward the vehicle, a long-haired man and a boy step out of the car and walk toward me. I see that the man has a gun, and I shout at him to drop it. The man continues walking toward me, and I reach for my sidearm, desperate for some element of control. I aim my weapon at the center of his body and yell for him to let go of his gun. He holds the weapon in his hand and looks at the boy. Then, before he turns again to look at me, I shoot him in the chest. His gun falls and slides across the ground, and I shoot him again, over and over, firing 5 shots from my weapon. When I look up from the dead man's body, I see that the boy has taken the gun and is crouched and aiming at me from behind the car. He shoots at me and misses. I turn and aim at him, gripping the gun with both hands. I fire at the boy twice, hitting him once in the head and once in the shoulder. I look at the scene before me and am gripped with profound panic. A crushing darkness washes over everything, and I throw my gun to the ground, terrified that I have become forever looped in a crippling exchange of violence. I think that I should call Hayward, that I should call my mother, and then I turn to look for the body of the dead man. I go over to make sure the body is still there, to see for certain that the man is dead. As I stand over him, moving his arm with the toe of my boot, I hear the boy struggling for air next to the car. I walk over and stand above his body, trying to understand how he could still be breathing. I'm alive, the boy gasps, looking at my face. Please kill me, he says. Please finish it. I stand and look down at the boy in silence before finally turning to walk away. Upon waking, I sit up in my bed and weep. I wish to make the sign of the cross, to offer out my hand. Brother Wolf, I wish to say, I will make peace between us, O Brother Wolf.